Margaret Chen pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the district courthouse, and the sound echoed through the marble hallway. She was 52 years old, wearing a simple floral dress she'd bought from the department store 3 years ago, and carrying her late father's old leather briefcase. The briefcase was scratched and faded, held together with a piece of duct tape on one corner. She looked exactly like what she was, a small-town librarian who spent her days organizing books and helping teenagers with their homework. The courtroom was already half full when she walked in. Margaret could feel eyes on her as she made her way down the aisle. She heard a few whispers, saw a few raised eyebrows. At the plaintiff's table sat 3 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than her monthly salary. The one in the middle, Richard Hartwell III, wore gold cufflinks that caught the light every time he moved his hands. He was talking to his colleagues, gesturing confidently, not even bothering to look at her. Margaret took her seat at the defendant's table. It felt huge and empty with just her sitting there. She placed her briefcase on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were manila folders, sticky notes in different colors, and a small spiral notebook with a pen clipped to it. Everything was organized just the way she liked it. "Ms. Chen," the judge said, looking down at her over his reading glasses. He was an older man with gray hair and a kind but tired face. "I see you're representing yourself today. Are you sure you don't want to request a court-appointed attorney? This is a complex property case." Margaret stood up and smoothed down her dress. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I'll be fine representing myself." The judge studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Margaret could see the doubt in his eyes. She'd seen that look before. It was the same look people gave her when she told them she'd rather spend Friday night organizing the library's archive room than going out. The look that said, "This poor woman has no idea what she's gotten herself into." Richard Hartwell leaned over to whisper something to the lawyer on his left. Both men smiled. The third lawyer, a younger woman with sharp features and an expensive haircut, glanced at Margaret and then quickly looked away, as if she felt embarrassed for her. The case was simple, at least on the surface. Margaret owned a small piece of property that had belonged to her mother. It wasn't much, just 2 acres of land with an old house that needed repairs, but it sat right in the middle of where Hartwell Development Corporation wanted to build their new luxury housing community. They'd made her an offer. She'd said no. They'd made another offer, higher this time. She'd said no again. And now they were suing her, claiming that the property boundaries were wrong, that she actually owned less land than she thought, and that part of what she considered her property was actually theirs. "The plaintiff may present their opening statement," the judge said. Richard Hartwell stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked to the center of the courtroom like an actor taking the stage. Margaret noticed he had that walk that confident men often have, the kind that takes up more space than necessary. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "This case is about facts, simple, undeniable facts. The defendant, Ms. Chen, is a librarian. A nice woman, I'm sure, but she's confused about property lines. She's emotional about her mother's old house, and that emotion has clouded her judgment." Margaret kept her expression neutral, but she wrote something in her notebook. "We have surveys," Hartwell continued, gesturing broadly. "We have documentation. We have expert testimony. All of it proves that Ms. Chen is mistaken about where her property ends and where the available land begins. She's refused multiple generous offers to purchase the land she does own, and instead has insisted on clinging to land that isn't actually hers." He turned slightly, just enough that Margaret could see his profile. There was a hint of a smile on his face. "Now we understand. Her mother passed away last year. It's hard to let go, but sentiment doesn't change legal boundaries. The law is clear and the law is on our side. We're asking this court to recognize the correct property lines and to stop Ms. Chen from preventing legitimate development that will bring jobs and housing to this community." He walked back to his table, and his colleagues nodded approvingly. One of them patted him on the shoulder. Margaret noticed that the younger lawyer was already looking confident again, tapping her pen against her legal pad in a steady rhythm. The judge turned to Margaret. "Ms. Chen, your opening statement?" Margaret stood up, and for a moment she felt the weight of everyone's attention. The gallery wasn't packed, but there were maybe 20 people scattered in the seats. A few local reporters with notepads, some people who looked like they worked for Hartwell Development, an elderly couple who lived near her property. She walked around her table but stayed close to it, keeping one hand resting on the edge. She didn't have Richard Hartwell's theatrical presence, and she didn't try to fake it. Your Honor, she said quietly but clearly, Mr. Hartwell is right about one thing. This case is about facts, but facts need to be accurate facts, not assumptions. Facts need to be complete, not selective. She paused, glancing down at her notes. I've brought documentation today, historical records, land surveys going back more than 100 years, environmental assessments, property deeds, and I'm going to show, piece by piece, that Hartwell Development Corporation's case is built on incomplete research and, frankly, on the assumption that I wouldn't bother to check their work. There was a shift in the room, small but noticeable. The judge sat up a little straighter. Richard Hartwell's smile faded just slightly. The young lawyer at the plaintiff's table stopped tapping her pen. I'm not a lawyer, Margaret continued. Mr. Hartwell made that very clear. I'm a librarian. But librarians know how to research. We know how to find information. We know how to verify sources and cross-reference documents, and that's exactly what I've done. She turned to look directly at Hartwell and his team. They expected me to just accept what they told me. They expected me to be intimidated by legal language and big surveys with official stamps. They expected me to give up. She turned back to the judge. But I didn't, because this land isn't just property to me. It's my mother's legacy, and I promised her I'd protect it. Margaret sat back down. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Then the judge cleared his throat. Very well, he said. The plaintiff may call their first witness. Richard Hartwell stood up again, and this time Margaret noticed his movements were a bit stiffer, a bit less flowing. We call Daniel Peterson to the stand. A man in his 40s walked up from the gallery. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt with a company logo on it. The bailiff swore him in, and he sat down in the witness stand. Mr. Peterson, Hartwell began, please state your occupation. I'm a licensed land surveyor. I've been doing this work for 18 years. And did you conduct a survey of the property in question? Yes, sir. Last March. And what did you find? Peterson pulled out a folder and opened it to show a large map covered in lines and numbers. Based on the current deed descriptions and the markers I found on site, the defendant's property is actually 1.3 acres, not 2 acres as she believes. Margaret was writing in her notebook again, quickly, her pen moving steadily across the page. And you're confident in this assessment? Hartwell asked. Absolutely. I used professional equipment and followed all standard procedures. Thank you. No further questions. The judge looked at Margaret. Ms. Chen, do you wish to cross-examine this witness? Margaret stood up and picked up her notebook. She also grabbed one of her manila folders. As she walked toward the witness stand, she caught Richard Hartwell exchanging a glance with his colleague. The glance said this should be quick, but Margaret wasn't nervous at all. In fact, if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the smallest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. She'd been waiting for this moment since the day she received the lawsuit papers 3 months ago. She opened her folder and pulled out a document. Then she looked up at Daniel Peterson and asked her first question in a voice that was calm, clear, and absolutely certain. Mr. Peterson, Margaret began, holding the document in her hand. You said you conducted your survey last March, is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Peterson shifted slightly in his seat. And you said you followed all standard procedures? That's right, Margaret nodded slowly. Did those standard procedures include researching historical surveys of the property? Peterson hesitated for just a second. I reviewed the documents that Hartwell Development provided to me. That's not what I asked. Margaret's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. Did you personally research historical surveys? Go to the county records office? Check archives? Well, no. I relied on the materials provided by my client. That's standard practice when... So you didn't see this survey from 1887? Margaret walked forward and handed him the document. Or this one from 1923? Or this one from 1956? Peterson took the papers and looked at them. His face went a little pale. Behind Margaret, she heard a chair creak as someone at the plaintiff's table leaned forward. These weren't in the materials I received, Peterson said. I'm sure they weren't, Margaret replied. Mr. Peterson, can you look at that 1887 survey? Do you see the stone marker mentioned in northwest corner, the one placed by the original surveyor, Joshua Blackwell? Peterson squinted at the old document. Yes, I see it mentioned here. Did you find that stone marker when you did your survey? No. But stone markers from the 1800s are often lost or buried over time. That's why we use modern techniques. Did you look for it? Margaret interrupted gently. Peterson paused. Not specifically, no. Margaret walked back to her table and pulled out a photograph. She showed it to Peterson. This is that stone marker. I found it 3 weeks ago, buried under about 6 inches of soil and leaves. It's still there exactly where the 1887 survey says it should be, and according to this original survey, that marker puts the property line 40 feet further out than your survey claims. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing more carefully as if afraid to miss a word. I'd need to verify that, Peterson said weakly. Of course you would, Margaret said. Your Honor, I have the GPS coordinates of the marker and photos from multiple angles. I'd like to submit these as evidence. Objection. Richard Hartwell was on his feet. Your Honor, these photos could have been taken anywhere. We have no way to verify. I have 3 witnesses who were present when I uncovered the marker, Margaret said calmly. One is a county clerk, one is a notary public, and one is actually a surveyor who worked in this county for 30 years before he retired. All 3 are here today and available to testify. The judge looked interested now. I'll allow the evidence. Please continue, Ms. Chen. Margaret turned back to Peterson. Mr. Peterson, in your 18 years as a surveyor, how many times have you been hired by Hartwell Development? Objection. Relevance? That was the younger lawyer standing up quickly. I'm establishing the witness's relationship with the plaintiff, Margaret said. It goes to potential bias. I'll allow it, the judge said. Please answer the question, Mr. Peterson. Peterson cleared his throat. Hartwell Development is one of my regular clients, maybe 15 or 20 times over the years. And do they pay you well? Objection. Sustained, the judge said. Move on, Ms. Chen. Mr. Peterson, when you're hired by a developer who wants to acquire land and you find that the property lines don't support their claim, what usually happens? Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Well, we report what we find. And does the developer usually continue to hire you if your findings aren't what they hoped for? That's not. We're professionals. We report the facts. Margaret let the silence hang for a moment. Then she said, no further questions. As she walked back to her table, she saw Richard Hartwell's jaw was clenched tight. The younger lawyer was frantically typing something on her phone. The third lawyer, the one who'd whispered with Hartwell earlier, was flipping through a stack of papers with increasing urgency. Your Honor, may we have a brief recess? Hartwell stood up stiffly. We just started. Mr. Hartwell, I understand, Your Honor, but I need to confer with my client about some new information that's come to light. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then at Margaret, then back at Hartwell. 15 minutes, he said finally. As soon as the judge left the courtroom, the plaintiff's table erupted in whispered conversation. Margaret could see Hartwell pointing at the surveys she'd introduced, his face red. The younger lawyer was shaking her head. Peterson, the surveyor, stood awkwardly by the witness stand until someone finally told him he could step down. Margaret calmly organized her papers. She pulled out another folder, this one blue instead of manila, and set it on top of her stack. Then she poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. An older man approached her from the gallery. He had white hair and kind eyes. Ms. Chen, I'm Robert Winters. I don't think we've met, but I live about 2 miles from your property. Nice to meet you, Mr. Winters. That was really something, he said quietly. The way you questioned that surveyor. Where did you learn to do that? Margaret smiled. Books, mostly. The law library has excellent resources. Mr. Winters looked like he wanted to say more, but the bailiff announced that court was resuming. He hurried back to his seat. When the judge returned, Richard Hartwell looked composed again, but Margaret noticed his collar seemed tighter than before. He kept pulling at it slightly. The plaintiff calls its next witness, the judge said. We call Thomas Brighton, Hartwell announced. A tall man in an expensive suit came forward. He had the kind of tan that comes from golf courses, not construction sites, and his hair was perfectly styled. The bailiff swore him in. Mr. Brighton, please state your occupation. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Hartwell Development Corporation. And can you tell the court about the development project planned for this area? Brighton launched into a polished presentation about the luxury homes they planned to build, the jobs it would create, the tax revenue for the county. He made it sound like Margaret was standing in the way of progress itself. He talked about the 12 families who would own beautiful homes, the construction workers who would be employed, the local businesses that would benefit. And how has Ms. Chen's refusal to sell impacted these plans? Hartwell asked. Significantly, Brighton said, looking regretful. Her property sits right in the center of our development. Without it, we can't proceed. We've offered her fair market value, even above market value, but she's refused every offer. Thank you. Your witness, Ms. Chen. Margaret stood up with her blue folder. Mr. Brighton, you mentioned the environmental impact of this development. Did your company conduct an environmental assessment? Of course. We follow all regulations. And what did that assessment find? Brighton looked confident. That the land is suitable for development. Margaret opened her blue folder and pulled out a thick document. Is this the environmental assessment your company filed with the county? Brighton glanced at it. Yes, that looks like it. Can you turn to page 17, please? Margaret pulled out her own copy and opened it. This section about wetlands. Can you read the highlighted portion? Brighton's confidence flickered. He read slowly. Potential wetland areas were identified but determined to be minimal and not subject to federal protection. Potential wetland areas, Margaret repeated. Mr. Brighton, did anyone from your company actually test the soil and water to confirm whether these were protected wetlands? I'm not a scientist, Ms. Chen. I handle the financial side. Fair enough. But as CFO, you sign off on these reports, correct? Your signature is right there on the last page? Yes, but... So you're responsible for ensuring the information is accurate? Margaret pulled out another document. Mr. Brighton, this is a report from the State Environmental Agency. It's from 2019. It clearly identifies a protected wetland on the property we're discussing today. The same property you claim is suitable for development. The courtroom stirred. Margaret heard someone in the gallery whisper excitedly to their neighbor. I'm not aware of that report, Brighton said. It's a public document, Margaret said. Available on the state website. I found it in about 20 minutes. She paused. You know what's interesting? The wetland identification was done because my mother requested it. She was worried about the ecosystem on her property. She wanted it protected. Margaret walked closer to the witness stand. Mr. Brighton, your company knew about this wetland designation, didn't they? Because they would have found it during any competent property research, which means your environmental assessment wasn't just incomplete. It deliberately omitted information that would have stopped your development project. Objection. Argumentative. The younger lawyer was on her feet. Sustained. Ms. Chen, stick to questions. Mr. Brighton, yes or no? Did anyone in your company know about the 2019 wetland designation before filing your environmental assessment? Brighton's face had gone from tan to red. I'd have to check with our research department. That's not a no, Margaret observed quietly. No further questions. As Brighton stepped down, Margaret saw one of the reporters in the gallery already typing on their laptop. This wasn't going the way anyone expected. The story was changing right there in the courtroom. Richard Hartwell stood up for redirect, but Margaret could see his earlier confidence was gone. He tried to rehabilitate his witness, asking Brighton about the economic benefits again, the jobs, the housing. But the damage was done. The questions about the wetland hung in the air like smoke. When the judge called for a lunch recess, the gallery buzzed with conversation. Margaret packed up her folders carefully. She noticed that people were looking at her differently now. Not with pity or doubt, but with curiosity, maybe even a little respect. As she walked out of the courtroom, the younger lawyer from Hartwell's team caught up with her in the hallway. Up close, Margaret could see she was probably in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes. Ms. Chen, she said quietly. Where did you really learn to do this? Margaret adjusted her grip on her briefcase. I told you. The library has excellent resources. The lawyer studied her face for a moment. Then she said something that surprised Margaret. Whatever they're paying me, it's not enough to keep doing this. She walked away before Margaret could respond. Margaret sat on a bench outside the courthouse during the lunch break, eating a sandwich she'd packed that morning. The sun was warm on her face and she watched people walking by on the sidewalk below. Some were lawyers in suits walking fast and talking on their phones. Others were regular people, maybe here for traffic tickets or small claims cases. Ms. Chen, a young man with a notebook, approached her. He had a press badge clipped to his shirt. I'm David Wu from the County Register. Could I ask you a few questions? Margaret wiped her hands on a napkin. I should probably wait until after the trial. Just one question then, he said. Everyone in that courtroom is wondering, are you really just a librarian? Margaret smiled. I really am a librarian. Have been for the last 12 years. The reporter looked like he wanted to ask more, but Margaret stood up and walked back inside before he could. She had more work to do. When court resumed after lunch, Richard Hartwell looked like a man who'd spent the break having a very unpleasant conversation. His earlier swagger was completely gone. He stood up and announced, "The plaintiff calls Richard Hartwell III to the stand." This was unusual. The head of the company, testifying in what should have been a simple property dispute. Margaret sat up straighter, her pen ready. After being sworn in, Hartwell settled into the witness chair. He looked directly at the judge, avoiding Margaret's eyes entirely. Mr. Hartwell, his own lawyer began, can you explain why Hartwell Development needs this particular property? It's centrally located in our planned community, Hartwell said. His voice was steady, practiced. Without it, the entire project becomes economically unfeasible. We've invested significant resources in planning and preliminary work based on acquiring this land. And you've made multiple offers to purchase it? Yes, each one more generous than the last. We've offered Ms. Chen twice the assessed value of the property, but she's refused? Yes, repeatedly. The lawyer nodded sympathetically. No further questions. Margaret stood up, and this time she brought several folders with her. She laid them out on the small table next to the witness stand, taking her time organizing them. Hartwell watched her with narrowed eyes. Mr. Hartwell, Margaret began, you said you've made generous offers for my property. How many offers exactly? 4, I believe. Margaret opened the first folder. According to these certified letters, you made 5 offers. The first one was in November of last year, 2 weeks after my mother passed away. Hartwell shifted. We saw the obituary. We knew the property might be available. 2 weeks after she died, Margaret repeated quietly. When I was still sorting through her things and planning her memorial service, you sent me an offer to buy her home. That's business, Ms. Chen. The timing was unfortunate. But let me ask you something else, Margaret interrupted. In December, I received a letter from the county building inspector saying there were code violations on my property. Violations that required immediate attention or I could face fines. Do you know anything about that? No, why would I? Margaret pulled out another document. Because according to this email I obtained through a public records request, someone from Hartwell Development contacted the building inspector and specifically requested he examine my property for violations. The courtroom went very quiet. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. That's standard due diligence, Hartwell said, but his voice had lost its certainty. When we're interested in a property, we need to know its condition. But you don't own the property, Mr. Hartwell, and you didn't have my permission to send inspectors onto my land. In fact, this same building inspector told me he'd never seen a request like that before. He said usually developers wait until they own the property. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the others. In January, I started receiving phone calls. Anonymous calls late at night, suggesting I should sell before something bad happened to the property. In February, someone started a rumor in town that I was mentally unstable, that grief had affected my judgment. In March, I found survey stakes on my property that didn't match the actual property lines. And in April, your company filed this lawsuit. She spread the timeline out like cards on a table. Mr. Hartwell, this wasn't just business. This was a systematic campaign to pressure me into selling. Objection. The younger lawyer was on her feet again. Your Honor, Ms. Chen is testifying, not asking questions. Sustained. Ms. Chen, please phrase your statements as questions. Margaret nodded. Mr. Hartwell, did your company engage in any activities designed to pressure or intimidate me into selling my property? Absolutely not. We made legitimate business offers. Did you authorize anyone in your company to spread rumors about my mental state? No. Did you authorize anyone to make threatening phone calls? No. Margaret paused, and in that pause something shifted in the courtroom. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce new evidence. Richard Hartwell's lawyer jumped up. Objection. We haven't been provided with this evidence in discovery. That's because I just obtained it 3 days ago, Margaret said calmly. I'm willing to provide copies to opposing counsel right now. The judge considered this. What is it, Ms. Chen? It's a recording of a conversation I had with Mr. Gerard Phillips, the operations manager at Hartwell Development. In my state, I'm legally allowed to record conversations I'm part of without informing the other party. Mr. Phillips called me last week to make what he said was a final offer. The judge leaned forward. I'll allow it, but counselor, he looked at Hartwell's team, you'll get a copy and we'll take a brief recess so you can review it. 20 minutes later, when court resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. The recording had played through the court sound system, and everyone had heard Gerard Phillips' voice saying things like, "The old librarian doesn't understand what she's up against, and we just need to wear her down a little more," and, most damning, "Once she realizes nobody in this town will believe her over us, she'll give up." Richard Hartwell's face had gone from red to pale. His lawyers were huddled together, whispering urgently. Margaret continued her questioning, her voice still calm and steady. "Mr. Hartwell, is Gerard Phillips employed by your company?" "Yes." "As operations manager?" "Yes." "Do you supervise his work?" "He reports to me, yes." "So when he talks about strategies to wear down a property owner, he's acting on behalf of Hartwell Development?" I'm not aware of the context of that conversation." Margaret pulled out yet another document. "Mr. Hartwell, I also have email correspondence between Mr. Phillips and your office discussing their acquisition strategy for my property. Would you like me to read some of these emails?" The younger lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, may we approach the bench?" The judge waved them forward. Margaret gathered her papers and walked up with the opposing counsel. The conversation was whispered, but Margaret could see the younger lawyer was agitated, gesturing at the emails and the recording. The judge's expression was growing darker by the minute. When they returned to their places, the judge said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." This time, when the break came, Margaret noticed something different. The reporters in the gallery were all on their phones, probably calling their editors. The elderly couple from earlier were talking animatedly. Even the bailiff was shaking his head in what looked like disbelief. But Margaret wasn't finished. Not even close. When court resumed, she asked the judge for permission to file an additional motion. "Your Honor, based on the evidence presented today, I'd like to file a countersuit against Hartwell Development Corporation for harassment, defamation, and attempted fraud." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. "Order. Ms. Chen, that's a serious accusation." "Yes, Your Honor, and I have serious evidence to support it." Margaret's voice was stronger now, more confident. "I have documented proof that this company engaged in a systematic campaign to harass and intimidate me. They spread false rumors about my mental competence. They sent anonymous threatening communications. They manipulated public officials to create problems for me, and they did all of this while knowing that their legal claim to my property was based on incomplete and deliberately misleading surveys." She turned to look at Richard Hartwell directly for the first time. "They targeted me because they thought I'd be easy. A middle-aged librarian who just lost her mother? She'd crumble under pressure. She'd take their money and leave quietly. They never expected me to fight back." The judge studied Margaret for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll hear your motion. But first, Mr. Hartwell, I have some questions of my own." For the next hour, the judge questioned Richard Hartwell about company practices, about oversight of employees, about due diligence procedures. And with each answer, it became clearer that Hartwell Development had cut corners, made assumptions, and engaged in behavior that was, at best, unethical and, at worst, illegal. Finally, the judge said, "I'm going to recess until tomorrow morning. Ms. Chen, you'll have the opportunity to present your countersuit. Mr. Hartwell's legal team, I suggest you spend this evening having a very serious conversation with your client about settlement options. Because from where I'm sitting, this case is not going the way you anticipated." As the courtroom emptied, Margaret packed up her materials. Her hands were steady, but inside her heart was racing. She'd just gone up against one of the most powerful development companies in the region, and she'd held her own. More than that, she'd exposed them. The young reporter, David Wu, caught her in the hallway again. This time, other reporters crowded around too. Ms. Chen, they called out. "Where did you learn to practice law? Have you done this before? Were you ever an attorney?" Margaret just smiled and said, "I really need to get home. I have a lot of work to do tonight to prepare for tomorrow." But as she walked down the courthouse steps, her old briefcase in hand, She passed by a window and caught her reflection. For just a moment she saw not the small-town librarian in the faded floral dress, but the person she used to be. The person she'd been before life changed her plans. The person who'd sworn to never set foot in a courtroom again. And she realized that sometimes, when something matters enough, you become who you need to be. Behind her, she could hear Richard Hartwell's raised voice as he argued with his lawyers in the parking lot. His perfect composure had finally cracked completely. Margaret got into her old sedan, placed her briefcase carefully on the passenger seat, and drove home. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more revelations. But tonight she had research to do. After all, she was a librarian. And librarians knew that the right information, found at the right time, could change everything. Margaret woke up at 5 in the morning. She hadn't slept much. Her dining room table was covered with papers, organized into neat stacks with colored tabs. She'd spent most of the night going through every document one more time, making sure every detail was correct. She made herself a cup of tea and stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the trees. The property stretched out behind her house, 2 acres of land that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her grandfather had planted those oak trees. Her mother had tended the garden by the back fence. And now someone wanted to pave it all over for luxury homes, not if Margaret had anything to say about it. She arrived at the courthouse an hour early. The hallways were empty except for janitors and a few early workers. Margaret found a bench near the courtroom and went through her notes one more time. She had everything memorized, but checking helped calm her nerves. By 8:30 the hallways were packed. Word had spread about yesterday's testimony. Margaret counted at least a dozen reporters, plus what looked like law students and curious locals. She even saw Mrs. Patterson from the library, who gave her an encouraging wave. Inside the courtroom, Richard Hartwell and his team were already seated. They looked different today. The expensive suits were still there, but the confident postures were gone. They sat close together, talking in low voices. The younger lawyer kept glancing at Margaret with an expression that might have been respect, or possibly fear. The judge entered, and everyone stood. When they sat back down, Margaret noticed that the gallery was completely full. People were standing in the back. "Ms. Chen," the judge said, "you filed a motion yesterday for a countersuit. I've reviewed your preliminary documents. You're alleging harassment, defamation, and attempted fraud. Those are serious charges. I'm prepared to hear your case, but I want to be clear. You'll need substantial evidence." "I have it, Your Honor," Margaret said, standing up. She felt surprisingly calm. She'd been up against worse odds than this before, though that was in a different life. "Proceed." Margaret walked to the center of the courtroom. She'd learned from watching Richard Hartwell. You didn't need to be theatrical, but you did need to command attention. "Your Honor, I'm going to show a pattern of behavior by Hartwell Development Corporation that goes beyond aggressive business tactics. This is a company that systematically targets vulnerable property owners and uses intimidation, misinformation, and manipulation to force them to sell." She pulled out a folder. "I'd like to start by calling my first witness. I call Helen Rodriguez to the stand." A woman in her 60s stood up from the gallery. She wore a neat pantsuit and walked confidently to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. "Ms. Rodriguez," Margaret began, "where do you live?" "About 6 miles from here on Porter Road." "And did you have any dealings with Hartwell Development Corporation?" "Yes, 2 years ago they wanted to buy my property. My husband and I had lived there for 30 years. When we said we weren't interested in selling, things got difficult." "Can you explain what you mean by difficult?" Helen Rodriguez took a breath. "First, they offered us money. Good money, actually, but we loved our home. We didn't want to leave. After we said no, we started having problems. The property tax assessment suddenly doubled. We got notices from the county about supposed code violations. Someone filed a complaint that our fence was on county property, which it wasn't. We spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and surveys. Did you eventually sell?" "Yes, we couldn't afford to keep fighting. We sold for much less than their original offer because by then we were desperate." Margaret showed her a document. "Is this the deed of sale?" "Yes." "And who purchased your property?" "Hartwell Development Corporation." "Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez." Richard Hartwell's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the current case." "It establishes a pattern," Margaret said calmly. It shows this is not an isolated incident. The judge nodded. I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Chen. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret called 3 more witnesses. Each one told a similar story. Properties targeted by Hartwell Development. Initial offers followed by pressure campaigns. Mysterious problems with permits and inspections. In 2 cases, the property owners had sold under duress. In 1 case, the owner had fought back and won, but it had cost him years of stress and legal bills. By the time Margaret finished, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Richard Hartwell's lawyers had stopped whispering to each other. They just sat there looking stunned. Your Honor, Margaret said, I have documentation for everything these witnesses described. Emails, letters, county records showing suspicious timing of inspections and complaints. And I have one more piece of evidence I'd like to introduce. She pulled out a thick binder. This is a list of 17 properties that Hartwell Development has acquired in this county over the past 5 years. I've researched each one. 13 of them followed the same pattern. An offer, a refusal, then a series of problems for the owner, followed by a sale at a reduced price. She handed the binder to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. I've included supporting documentation for each property. Property records, complaint filings, correspondence. It's all there. The judge flipped through the binder, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up at Richard Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you to take the stand again. Hartwell stood up slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. When he sat in the witness box, he didn't meet anyone's eyes. Mr. Hartwell, the judge said, I've just reviewed evidence of a pattern of behavior that is, frankly, disturbing. Before I hear from your counsel, I want to hear from you directly. Did you or your company engage in the tactics Ms. Chen and these witnesses have described? Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Margaret could see him weighing his options. Deny it and risk perjury. Admit it and face the consequences. Your Honor, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The real estate development business is highly competitive. Sometimes we use aggressive tactics to secure properties we need. Aggressive tactics, the judge repeated. Is that what you call manipulating public officials? Spreading false information about property owners? Harassment? We never intended. Intent doesn't matter, Mr. Hartwell. Actions matter. Results matter. The judge's voice was stern. Ms. Chen, I'm ready to hear what you're asking for in your countersuit. Margaret stood up. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. Your Honor, I'm asking for several things. First, compensatory damages for the emotional distress, lost time, and expenses I've incurred defending myself against this baseless lawsuit. Second, punitive damages to send a clear message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Third, a formal public apology from Hartwell Development Corporation. And fourth, I'm requesting that this court refer this matter to the State Attorney General for investigation of potential criminal violations. The gallery erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel. Order! Richard Hartwell's lead lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, may we request a recess to discuss settlement options with our client? The judge looked at his watch. It's already 11:30. We'll break for lunch. 2 hours. When we return, I want to hear either a settlement proposal or we'll continue with Ms. Chen's case. But I'll tell you right now, Mr. Hartwell, based on what I've seen so far, you're in serious trouble. During the lunch break, Margaret didn't leave the courthouse. She sat in a small attorney conference room that a sympathetic clerk had let her use. She wasn't hungry. She was too focused, too keyed up. There was a knock on the door. Margaret looked up to see the younger lawyer from Hartwell's team. She came in and closed the door behind her. Ms. Chen, I'm Jennifer Lopez. I wanted to talk to you off the record. Margaret gestured to a chair. Sit down. Jennifer sat, and Margaret could see she was struggling with something. I need to tell you something. I've been with Hartwell Development for 3 years. This is my first big firm job out of law school. I thought I was doing good work, helping develop communities. She paused. But yesterday, after court, I went back to the office and started looking through our old case files. Everything you said. It's all true. I found records of the Rodriguez case and the others. I found internal emails discussing pressure strategies and leveraging municipal relationships. I found... She stopped, her voice catching. I found things that made me ashamed to have my name on this case. Margaret waited. She'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was just listen. I can't be part of this anymore, Jennifer continued. I'm going to withdraw from the case this afternoon. But before I do, I wanted you to know something. There's more. More properties, more tactics, more victims. If you really want to take them down, if you really want to make sure this never happens again, there are files you should see. Jennifer, Margaret said carefully, you're talking about violating attorney-client privilege. No, I'm talking about files that show criminal activity. There's an exception for that. And honestly, at this point, I don't care about my career as much as I care about doing the right thing. She pulled out a flash drive and set it on the table. Everything's on here. Organized by property. I'm giving this to you. And then I'm going to give the same information to the State Attorney General's office. Margaret looked at the flash drive, then at Jennifer. This could destroy your career. Maybe. Or maybe it'll save it. Jennifer stood up. Not all of us went to law school to help rich people intimidate poor ones. After Jennifer left, Margaret sat alone with the flash drive. She thought about her mother who'd loved this land. She thought about Helen Rodriguez and the other people who'd been forced from their homes. She thought about all the people who might be targeted in the future if Hartwell development wasn't stopped. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop and started reading. By the time court resumed, Margaret had a new fire in her eyes. She'd seen the files. She knew exactly how deep this went. When the judge asked if there was a settlement proposal, Richard Hartwell's remaining lawyers stood up. They looked defeated. Your Honor, our client wishes to settle. We're prepared to offer Ms. Chen full compensation for her legal expenses and— No, Margaret said, standing up. Everyone turned to look at her. No, the judge said. No, Your Honor, I'm not interested in a quiet settlement. Not anymore. Margaret looked directly at Richard Hartwell. I want a full public trial. I want everything brought into the light, because this isn't just about my property anymore. It's about every person they've done this to, and every person they might do it to in the future. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Richard Hartwell looked like he might be sick. In fact, Margaret continued, I have new evidence that was just provided to me by a former member of the defense team. Evidence of criminal activity spanning multiple years and dozens of properties. She held up the flash drive. Your Honor, I'd like to request that these proceedings be expanded to include a full investigation of Hartwell Development Corporation's business practices. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret. Then he smiled just slightly. Ms. Chen, I think it's time you told us the truth about who you really are.